Chapter 2 The Z Test. When Julius entered the building, he found himself in a large, well-lit reception area. A guard in a grey uniform was directing everybody to join a long snake-like line to the enrollment desk. Except for a female voice shouting, "Next!" at regular intervals, the room was surprisingly quiet. Julius looked around. The walls on either side of the hall were covered with portraits of people that he didn't recognize. All of them were wearing black suits with numerous medals pinned to their chests. Under each frame was a small golden plaque bearing the name of the person portrayed. He noticed that one picture was much larger than the rest and was placed on its own high above the reception desk. Although it was quite far for him to read the inscription, he instantly knew who the man in the portrait was. In fact, there was not one person on earth who didn't know of him: Marcus Tijara. He was the man who had almost single-handedly brought Earth into the space era, researched the white and grey arts, and most important of all, in Julius' opinion, created the Z lunar perimeter. "Julius, look!" said Morgana, tapping excitedly on his shoulder. She was pointing at 3 full-size portraits to their left. "This is Roland Cloyster, the Grand Master of Kaori's school, Tuala. And this is Edwina Milson, the head of Sealed School, which means that this man here is Carlos Freja, the current Grand Master of Tijara School. Kaori's had the people speak of him as being the true heir of Marcus Tijara." Julius stared, fascinated by Freja's portrait. It was difficult to tell what his age was. His body looked tall and sturdy, his hair dark and short, but his face seemed worn and his intense grey eyes were surrounded by lines. Julius thought that if he was accepted into Z, he would want to go to Tijara and study under Carlos Freja. In that moment, he felt such admiration for this man who he did not even know, that a sense of guilt crept over him because he realized that he had never felt like that about anyone, not even his own father. Ashamed, he pulled his eyes away from the picture. Beside him, Morgana was looking above the heads of the other children in an effort to see how far they were from the desk. "At least the queue is moving quickly," she said. "Good, 'cause I really need the toilet," said a voice behind them. Julius and Morgana turned around and then looked upward. Seated in a hovering wheelchair, a grinning boy looked down at them. Beneath a bed of tangled brown hair, 2 hazelnut eyes moved nervously from Julius to Morgana. After a brief awkward silence, the boy offered his hand. "Hi, I'm Faith, from Ireland." Morgana, who had always been more relaxed with strangers than Julius, grabbed his hand and shook it vigorously. "Hi, I'm Morgana, and this is Julius. From here. Well, kinda. I'm actually from Japan, but my dad is Scottish. That's why I'm doing the test here." The boys nodded to each other. Morgana seemed quite happy to talk away while they were waiting, but Julius was still too nervous for that, so he kept quiet and occasionally dragged Morgana forward in the queue by her arm. "That's a really flashy transport you've got there," said Morgana, examining Faith's wheelchair from every angle. "A Ladybird 300, but with the electric core of an early Grasshopper model. How unusual." "Wow, I'm impressed," replied Faith. "I haven't met many people who would know the model of my chair, let alone noticing that the core was different. Are you into engineering?" "She's going to be a space pilot," cut in Julius from over his shoulder. Morgana blushed a little and smiled. "I'd like to." "That's wonderful," said Faith. "It's no easy job either. I want to be a spaceship architect and engineer and build the most amazing ships you'll ever see. Meantime, I'm practicing on my chair. By using different parts, not only I can get it to spin, but also to hover and jump. I'm working on making it fly right now. I've kept the wheels functioning though, 'cause you never know. My friend Roy Bray back home, that would be Dublin by the way, broke down one day and his wheels were only there for show, so I had to tow him all the way to his house. By the time we got there, his tires had gone and he was sending sparks everywhere like a firework, finished Faith in a fit of laughter. Right side, I bet, said Morgana, giggling. Even Julius was smiling despite his nervousness. Under the puzzled stares of several people, and because they were getting closer to the desk, they managed to pull themselves together. Eventually, it was Julius' turn to enroll. A long-faced lady stared gravely at him from behind the desk. "Name-cheap documents," she cried in one breath. "Julius McCoy," blurted out Julius, startled. He quickly handed her his folder. She didn't seem willing to wait for even 1 second. "She's probably been doing this since dawn," thought Julius. The lady kept hold of his invitation sheet and folder and slammed a visitor pass onto the desk. Before Julius could even say thanks, she raised her face and shouted, "Next!" Beyond the desk, a guard asked Julius to enter a room to the left. He waved back at Morgana and did so. The new space was long and bare and had all sorts of monitors and what looked like a metallic tunnel structure on the far end. 8 boys were already sitting along the wall near the entrance. Julius moved next to a square-faced boy with rather large shoulders and an expression of boredom on his face. The visitor pass around his thick neck said that his name was Billy Summers. Julius was about to sit down when a whistling Faith entered the room and positioned himself next to him. Summers glanced over at Faith. "If he's not worried about the physical test, we really shouldn't be," he said with a snigger, to no one in particular, and clearly without any concern that he might be heard. Faith stared blankly at him for a few seconds, and suddenly broke into a broad grin. He then turned his attention to the various devices in the room as if nothing had happened. Summers, like Julius and the rest of the boys, was caught off guard for a moment by Faith's reaction, but any further retaliation was cut short by 2 men in white coats who entered the room and shut the door behind them. One of them was carrying a small pile of folders and walked directly towards a desk at the back, where he sat down. The other one stopped in front of the boys. "Gentlemen, this is your physical test. We don't have time to waste, so when I call your name, step forward to the tunnel scan and walk. I repeat, walk through it." He then looked at a small blond boy. "Ton, Roger, follow me." He turned and walked towards the large device, with the little boy hurrying behind him. Julius watched Roger Ton approach the tunnel scan and disappeared under the thick metal arch. He noticed that everybody else was watching intently, except Faith, who was examining his fingernails. The doctors worked fast. Julius watched each boy walk through the tunnel and leave the room until his turn came. When he stepped under the tunnel scan, one of the doctors told him to look straight ahead. Numerous colored lights blinked on and off around him, accompanied by tiny beeping sounds. When he stepped outside, he saw a wide and long screen to his left that showed all the information they had gathered from his body. He didn't have time to read any of it, though, because his full skeleton suddenly appeared on the screen, staring back at him. The word "pass" flashed in green across it. "Move along now. Leave through that door," said one of the doctors, pointing at the exit. Julius returned to the corridor and joined the others, who were waiting for everyone to finish their medical tests. They were all quiet, and he was pleased to see he wasn't the only fidgety one. He looked towards the reception, noting that it was still crowded, while dozens more people were swarming through the front door. Julius briefly thought that at that very moment, across the planet and on each of the Earth colonies, all children aged 12 were being examined in their own country's Z-test center. Only 100 of them would make it to Z, though, and he strongly hoped that Morgana and he were good enough to be among the chosen ones. The medical test had been fine, and that was no small relief, but the hardest part was about to begin. They were going to test his mind skills, on which his chances of entering Z would rest entirely. How they would do that, however, Julius had no idea. "I hope they ask me to start a fire or move something with my mind," he thought. but that immediately made him recall that he still wasn't very good at putting the fires out afterwards, and that Michael's landing that very morning had not gone too smoothly. For the next few minutes, Julius mentally went through all the skills he'd ever used and concentrated on the correct dose of energy to use for each of them. Like his father had said, he really didn't want to destroy anything, which had been known to happen. When Faith finally joined them, a different man in a grey uniform walked towards them. "Follow me, gentlemen, single file, and do not lag behind." He then turned and started down a staircase. They hurried after him, Julius accompanied by the gentle hum of Faith's chair behind him. A few minutes later, they reached a small room. It was unfurnished except for several bulky cardboard boxes spread to one side of the room. Some of them were flattened and piled against one of the walls. A gangly man with dark hair starkly flattened against his head grabbed a handful of small black objects from an open box and stamped them indelicately to each of the boys' foreheads. "These are self-adhesive microchips," he said in a bored voice. Everybody looked at each other puzzled, while someone grunted in the back. Even the guard was straining to suppress a laugh. The man, clearly oblivious of the reaction to his lisp, took no notice and continued with his chant. "Do not remove them until you're told to do so. Your brain activity will be transmitted through them and recorded on the center boxes during your test. There are 5 luminous points on the chip. When all of them turn red, you will hear a beeping sound in your head. That is your cue to move to the exit." "I can't really see my own forehead, sir," ventured Faith. "I'm sure your friends will tell you," he replied, uninterested. Julius nodded, trying to keep a straight face. Once out of the room, the guard led them along a narrow descending corridor. "We must be underground," said. It was an obvious statement to make, but now that the laughter had passed, he felt anxiety creeping back. Between the medical test, the chip on his forehead, and walking along artificially illuminated empty corridors, he felt as if he was on a conveyor belt. "I can see why Kaori said that the test's not really difficult," thought Julius, frustrated. He was being scanned and tagged, but nobody was interacting with him or asking him to prove himself. He was about to share his feeling with Faith when the guard huddled them all in front of a double door. He then pushed a button, and a wall came down behind them, enclosing them in a small space. A few seconds later, the door in front of them opened, and Julius felt a wave of energy passing through him that made his hair stand on end, while his ears were trying to adjust to the loud noises assaulting him from every direction. He was staring at the biggest room he had ever seen. "Holy fagioli! This room's gotta be at least 15 meters high," shouted Faith. "No kidding," replied Julius. If Faith's estimation was anything to go by, then the room must have been easily 100 meters long. He saw dozens of sensors boxes all along the walls. Beneath them, numerous adults in white coats and helmets were busy typing notes on their pads. In the corners, large computerized panels flashed constantly. If Julius thought that the sidelines were busy, the middle of the room was positively chaotic. Hordes of boys were running around while boxes, chairs, and the occasional desk zoomed along the ceiling. Several small fires burned brightly here and there. From what he could tell, they were seemingly using their mind skills for an obstacle course of some sort. Only there was no visible course. Each person was acting independently, performing whatever task they chose, from shifting objects with their minds to starting fires. Some just stared blankly at the teachers. The lights on their foreheads were showing different colors. The majority of them were yellow, some were green, and only one boy, Julio noticed, had 2 red lights on his forehead. "They look like running Christmas trees," said Faith. "What are they doing?" asked Julius, incredulous. Without warning, the guard behind them blew a whistle. "Your turn! Move it!" he shouted. They stepped into the crowd anxiously, as if they were walking through a panic-stricken herd of buffaloes. but it took Julius only a few moments to adjust to the chaos around him. "I suppose they just want me to show my skills," thought Julius. At that moment, he heard a loud and clear voice inside his head. "Make them fly!" He didn't recognize the voice, but he instinctively knew it was a command. In front of him, he saw two little boys attempting to create a fire. Julius concentrated and fixed his gaze on them. Instantly, they both levitated off the ground, puzzled expressions on their faces. When they were a meter above the floor and bouncing like yo-yos in midair, they started to scream, but among all the chaos, no one heard them. Julius kept his mind locked on them and shot them across the room. When he thought that they looked green enough, he gently landed them back on the floor. He then touched his forehead, trying to figure out if his sensors had gone off, but to his frustration he couldn't tell. He sidestepped as a box flew past his head and glanced around, looking for the next challenge. Suddenly, the same voice popped into his head. "Quick! Danger above you!" Julius looked up. A fire extinguisher was plummeting through the air towards Faith, who was busy turning someone else's small fire into a blazing furnace. Behind him, the owner of the fire extinguisher was running with his nose pointed to the ceiling, trying to regain control of it, oblivious of Faith's bonfire. Julius locked his eyes onto the fire extinguisher and stopped it a couple of meters above Faith's head. At the same time, he ordered Faith to halt the boy behind him. He did this wordlessly, with his mind. Faith promptly extended his hand towards the boy, who stopped dead in his tracks, as if he had hit an invisible wall. Julius then landed the extinguisher gently on Faith's lap, who took it and put out his fire. Julius let out a sigh of relief and, walking towards Faith, looked down at the ashes of the bonfire. A bright crimson flame instantly sprang from the ground, lighting up the room. "Show off," said Faith, laughing. At that moment, Julius felt a strong buzzing sensation in his head. "Your sensors are all red. Am I lit up too?" shouted Faith over the noise. "Yeah, that was quick. We've got to get out of here," replied Julius. "Lead on." They jostled their way through the crowd, Julius moving people out of their path with small mind pushes. Once out of the room, the buzzing in their ears stopped. There were 10 cubicles lined in front of them. A man told them to queue at different ones. "Good luck," said Julius. "Same to you," answered Faith before they got separated. When Julius finally sat down, a young lady in a white coat smiled at him and, with a pair of tweezers, peeled the chip off his forehead. He was knotting his hands together, unable to sit still. "Are you nervous?" she asked him. Julius nodded and tried to smile, but his mouth had dried up. He watched her place the chip into a machine that looked like a microwave. She then closed the door and a red light flashed on. He sat there for what seemed like an age. Seconds felt like years. He was glad to be in a cubicle where no one could see him, for in that moment he was sure he had failed and that the lady was going to tell him that they were sorry, but it just wasn't good enough. Finally, a green light blinked on, and the machine printed out several pages of charts and symbols that Julius couldn't understand. He looked at the woman. She looked at the charts, wide-eyed. With an encouraging, surprised smile, she looked back at Julius. "I believe congratulations are in order." Julius' face broke into the biggest grin, totally at loss for words. "Follow the corridor," said the lady. "There is a waiting room 2 floors up and on the left. Someone will need to see you before you can go." Julius thanked her and walked past her desk into the corridor beyond. The noise slowly subsided behind him. He went up the stairs in a blissful trance and eventually found himself in front of the waiting room. As he entered the room, he was relieved to see that Morgana was already there, talking enthusiastically to a red-haired girl. When she saw him, she ran towards him, grabbed his shirt, and looked into his eyes. "Do you know what this means?" whispered Morgana excitedly. "It means that we are in!" Julius was beaming. He still couldn't believe it. His stomach was full of butterflies. He was so charged up that he felt as if he could have lifted the roof off the building with just a blink of his eye. He looked around and saw 2 people chatting at one of the tables and, in another corner, on his own, sat a very smug-looking Billy Summers, intently reading a magazine. Julius realized that of all the dozens of children he had seen that morning, only 6 were sitting in their room. He was proud to be among them, and more so because Morgana was there too. He also hoped that Faith would join them soon, since, without him, Julius could not have displayed his abilities so clearly or finished the test so quickly. Besides, Faith had performed well and had shown that he was surprisingly receptive to Julius' mind messages. Before then, only Morgana had ever responded so quickly to Julius, and they had known each other for many years. As if in answer to his wish, the waiting room door opened. With the happiest expression, Faith entered the room, followed by an officer, who took a seat in the corner. Julius and Morgana went over to congratulate him. As they walked past where Summers was sitting, Julius noticed his Magnus had been replaced by a mixed expression of shock and disgust. He looked as if he was about to burst, but obviously thought better of saying anything with an officer present. As Faith took his place next to Julius, he flashed a cheeky grin in the direction of the now positively furious Billy Summers. For the next 2 hours, everyone in the room, with the exception of Summers, chatted about the events of that morning, sharing detailed descriptions of their tasks. They all agreed on how lucky they had been to make it through. "Anyway, what's the story with that room of chaos? People could have hurt themselves," said the red-haired girl in a thick Welsh accent. Morgana had introduced her as Leslie Rogan. "It's so that they can test your skills under pressure, of course," answered Faith. "They figure that when you're in trouble, you don't have time to think, so they want people who are quick. Speaking of which, Julius, next time you send me a mind email like you did before, do it gently. You almost blew my brain off." "Oh, I'm sorry. Next time I'll come and ask your permission first." "Did you really speak with Faith?" asked Alan Cross, one of the other selected people. "I mean, I could hear the messages from the teachers, but I couldn't really speak back." "Sure he did," cut in Morgana. "Julius is very good at that. When we were 6, we used to team up at card games and cheat all our parents' friends out of their small change. I would challenge them, he would stand behind them, look at their cards, and then tell me what they were with his mind." "Remind me never to play cards with you, Julius," said Faith, raising an eyebrow. Finally, the door opened. A man in a navy blue uniform entered and stopped in the middle of the room, facing the group. He was tall and athletic, and although his expression was rather stern, he had a young, attractive face. He looked at each of them in turn, and for a few moments not a sound could be heard. Julius grew a little uncomfortable under his gaze. As his eyes moved to the next person, Julius could have sworn that he had smiled almost imperceptibly at him. "I am Master Cress, second in command of the Tijara school," he said. His clear voice echoed in the room. "You have been selected to join the Z Academy. It is a great honor, but also the end of life as you know it." With that, he reached into his pocket and drew out several small envelopes. "Marion Lloyd and Billy Summers, step forward. You are to join the sealed school." He handed them an envelope each, which they took before stepping back again. "Alan Cross and Leslie Rogan, Tuala School," he continued. Julius could see that Morgana was quite disappointed because she had really wanted to join her sister Kaori at Tuala. "Julius McCoy, Morgana Routhier, and Faith Shanigan, Tijara School." They moved forward to receive their envelopes. Julius was pleased to see that he wasn't the only one who was trembling nervously. Faith's chair was practically vibrating beneath the excitement of its owner. Julius looked at the envelope that had his name printed on it. Next to it, they had written 1MJ. Morgana had told him that all first and second year students were called Mitsuki Jr., and that Mitsuki was the name of the scientist who had first studied mind skills alongside Marcus Tijara. "The envelope contains all the necessary information that you and your parents need to read," continued Cress. "On Sunday, the 31st of August, you are to report here at 0800 hours. A shuttle will fly you to the Z Departure Center in Prague. Latecomers will, of course, remain here. You are now free to go," he finished. With that, he nodded to the group and left the room without so much as a second glance. "That guy needs to chill," exclaimed Faith once the door had closed. That made all of them burst into laughter, all except Somers, that is, who simply walked out of the room with his nose upturned. And he could do with the same therapy, added Julius, pointing to Somers, adding fuel to their laughter. He could feel the tension of the morning ebbing slowly away and being replaced by a sense of relief. Julius was struck by a certainty that he would always remember this moment as one of genuine, shared happiness between a group of people who had just realized their greatest dream. Nathan Kress stood peering through the window of his office, which overlooked the main entrance. His eyes followed Julius as he left the building. As soon as the boy had disappeared into the fly-car park, a beeping noise caught his attention. He turned towards the center of the room and crossed his arms in front of him. "Good day, Carlos." The holographic shape of the Grand Master Tijara, Carlos Freja, appeared in the middle of the room. "And to you, Nathan," said Freja. "I trust you have good news?" "You were right. The boy's mind skills are off the charts and balanced right across the board. And he hasn't even started his training yet," said Kress with a tinge of excitement in his voice. "He is a natural white child." Freja nodded. "Perfect. Salgoria must not know, or she will go after him too. Her threat is growing as we speak, but we shall be ready for her when the time comes. Train him hard, keep him safe. You know what to do." "Of course, leave that to me," said Kress, as the hologram slowly faded. End of chapter 2.